It was a brutal murder that sent one man to prison for nearly 19 years before his conviction collapsed. This is the true crime story of Carol Wilkinson. Every murder investigation begins with uncertainty. A victim is found, a timeline starts to form, and detectives begin trying to understand what happened in the narrow space between an ordinary day and a violent crime. Sometimes the evidence points clearly in one direction, sometimes it does not, and occasionally a case produces something even more troubling than an unsolved murder, a conviction that later collapses under the weight of its own weaknesses. That is what happened after the murder of 20-year-old Carol Anne Wilkinson in Bradford, West Yorkshire. On Monday, the 10th of October 1977, Carol was making her way to work at a bakery on Gain Lane. Later accounts say industrial action affecting local buses meant she travelled on foot that morning. Somewhere near Woodhall Road, between roughly 9 and 9:30, her journey ended in a brutal attack. What followed would become one of Bradford's most disturbing unsolved cases and one of Britain's most troubling miscarriages of justice. Carol lived in the Ravenscliffe area of Bradford and was engaged to Kevin Best. Public records preserve only fragments of her private life. They confirm her age, her relationship, her workplace, and the area where she lived, but they do not provide the kind of intimate personal detail that later storytelling can be tempted to invent. What can be said with confidence is that Carol was a young working woman with a fiancé, a routine, and a destination that morning. Her life was not defined by the crime that later consumed the public record. The attack happened close to Woodhall Road. Carol was found unconscious shortly afterwards. She had been partially undressed and sexually assaulted, and she had suffered multiple fractures to her skull after being struck with a large stone. An earlier appeal record described the stone as weighing around 50 pounds. She also suffered catastrophic brain injuries. The violence had been extreme, but Carol was still alive when she was discovered. At around 10:15 that morning, she was admitted to Bradford Royal Infirmary. Roughly an hour later, she was transferred to intensive care and placed on mechanical ventilation. By that evening, neurological examinations showed profound brain damage. The following day, testing found no cerebral blood flow, while further electrical examinations failed to show meaningful brain activity. On the 12th of October, doctors repeated the tests. The result did not change. At around 6:15 that evening, artificial ventilation was withdrawn. 25 minutes later, at around 20 to 7, Carol was pronounced dead. The legal consequences of that medical decision would later reach the Court of Appeal, but there was no doubt about the underlying cause. Carol had died because of the injuries inflicted during the attack. Police began carrying out inquiries across the Ravenscliffe area. On the 13th of October, 3 days after the assault, officers spoke with a local man named Anthony Steele. Steele was 21 at the time and worked as a gardener. He lived at 45 Langdale Road, within the same broader estate. He told police that he had gone to work at around 8:20 on the morning of the attack and returned home at about 9. For the next year and a half, Steele was not charged. Then the investigation shifted because of an object that would later become central to the prosecution case, a fish-shaped keyring. A relative connected to Steele gave the item to police, and investigators developed the theory that it might once have belonged to Carol. If Steele had taken it from her after the attack, it could provide a physical link between him and the victim. The problem was that the identification of the keyring was never secure. Some witnesses thought it resembled one Carol had owned. Others remembered different details. Kevin Best said he had never seen Carol with such a key ring. A colleague who saw Carol regularly could not remember one either. Even at trial, the object was treated as limited supporting evidence rather than a conclusive link. On the 23rd of April 1979, Anthony Steele was arrested. He would remain in police custody for more than 45 hours. During that period, there were 7 interview contacts. The first 3 produced repeated denials. Steele said he had not killed Carol. He had no solicitor present during those interviews, and no responsible adult was there to assist him. The timing matters because Steele's vulnerability was not properly understood at the time. Before his trial, testing had already produced a low intelligence score, but the implications for prolonged police questioning were not fully explored in front of the jury. Decades later, psychologists would uncover something far more significant than a single low score. During the 4th interview, on the 25th of April, Steele's answers began to change. He started making statements that implicated himself. His language was hesitant and uncertain. At one point, he expressed the idea that he must have done it. In the 5th interview, police obtained a written statement running to 5 pages. That statement became the heart of the murder case. In it, Steele described seeing Carol, following her and trying to speak to her. He described a struggle near a wall, following her over it, grabbing her and wrestling with her on the ground. He also said he had taken a fish-shaped key ring. For investigators, the statement appeared to explain how Steele knew about an object they believed had belonged to Carol. But the statement had a serious evidential weakness. It did not contain an independent description of the most distinctive violence in the crime. Steele did not properly describe the massive attack with the stone. He did not independently give a convincing account of the sexual assault. Those details were raised by police during later questioning. When asked about Carol's clothing, the sexual violence and the stone, Steele repeatedly said he could not remember. Shortly after the 6th interview, solicitor David Taylor arrived to see him. Taylor later described Steele as highly distressed. Steele immediately withdrew the confession and said the police had pressured him into admitting something he had not done. Taylor asked for further questioning to stop. Later that evening, another contact took place. Police would describe it as informal. Steele would later describe continued pressure. There was no conventional written interview record of that final encounter. Steele also alleged that officers had shouted at him, physically mistreated him, and denied him earlier access to legal advice. The officers denied those claims. At his trial, the judge accepted the police version and allowed the confession into evidence. The jury was therefore left with what appeared to be a straightforward choice. Either Steele had confessed truthfully, or he was falsely accusing officers of coercion. That framing would become one of the biggest problems in the case. On the 13th of December 1979, at Leeds Crown Court, Anthony Steele was convicted of Carol Wilkinson's murder by a majority of 11-1. He received a life sentence. The prosecution case rested heavily on his confession, supported to a limited extent by the disputed keyring and by inconsistencies in his account of his movements. The later appeal judgment did not identify any forensic evidence that individually placed Steele at the crime scene. Steele appealed, but the challenge failed on the 17th of March 1981. That appeal became legally notable because the defense argued that the doctors who ended Carol's artificial ventilation might have broken the chain of causation between the attack and her death. The Court of Appeal rejected the argument. The fatal injuries remained the legal cause of death. Steele stayed in prison while doubts about his conviction slowly grew. In the mid-1980s, the BBC programme Rough Justice examined the case publicly. Campaigners continued pressing the argument that his confession might not have been reliable. Years later, specialist psychological testing finally began to explain why. In March of 1996, psychologist Olive Tunstall examined Steele for several hours. Her findings went far beyond simply describing him as intellectually limited. She found him unusually suggestible and highly compliant, especially in situations involving authority. His reading and mathematical abilities were low, and his psychological profile suggested that he was far more vulnerable than the average person to changing answers or accepting suggestions under pressure. Further assessments in 2001 reinforced those conclusions. Steele recorded an IQ of 65. Charles Burdett, a psychologist instructed for the Crown, independently produced a very similar figure of 64. Burdett also found Steele's level of suggestibility to be extraordinarily high, around the 99th percentile. That created a third possibility that the original jury had never properly been asked to consider. Police officers did not necessarily have to be lying about how the interviews were conducted. Steele did not necessarily have to be telling the truth about every allegation of mistreatment. A highly suggestible and intellectually vulnerable young man could produce an unreliable confession during prolonged questioning, even without deliberate police misconduct. That possibility transformed the case. The Criminal Cases Review Commission received Steele's application in October of 1997. He was released on license in 1998 after spending roughly 19 years in prison, but the murder conviction still remained in place. In July of 2000, the Commission referred the case back to the Court of Appeal. Then the forensic evidence was reviewed again. In September of 2002, Mark Bates of the Forensic Science Service examined the surviving material. The review did not identify Carroll's killer, but it did reveal further problems with the confession. Blood evidence near the scene was difficult to reconcile with parts of Steele's version of events. The position of some of Carroll's injuries also suggested that the attack may not have happened in the way his statement described. On the 28th of February 2003, the Court of Appeal quashed Anthony Steele's conviction. The court ruled that the conviction was unsafe. The written judgment issued later that year focused heavily on the psychological evidence that had never been properly available to the original jury. The confession could no longer be treated as a reliable foundation for a murder conviction. The court did not declare that another named person had killed Carroll. It did not solve the murder, nor did it make a positive legal finding that every allegation Steele had made against the police was true. What it did establish was that the jury had not been given the information needed to understand just how vulnerable Steele was during questioning. Once that conviction disappeared, attention returned to another question that had shadowed the case for years. Could Carroll have been a victim of Peter Sutcliffe, the man later identified as the Yorkshire Ripper? There are reasons the theory has persisted. Carroll was a young woman walking alone in West Yorkshire during the years Sutcliffe was active. She suffered massive violence to the head. Her clothing had been disturbed, and the assault had a sexual element. The later Bradford report into the Yorkshire Ripper investigation concluded that Sutcliffe may have been responsible for additional attacks that had never been formally attributed to him. The same report also exposed major weaknesses in the wider investigation into Sutcliffe. Police were dealing with enormous volumes of information, manual filing systems, inconsistent methods, and narrow criteria for connecting attacks. Some relevant cases may have been overlooked because they did not fit the working assumptions closely enough. But none of that proves Sutcliffe killed Carroll. There is no publicly documented forensic evidence linking him to her murder. He did not confess to killing her. The main weapon in Carroll's case was described as a large stone, while Sutcliffe's established attacks more commonly involved tools such as a hammer, often followed by stabbing or other injuries. Later writers and television programs have advanced further claims about possible personal connections between Sutcliffe and Carroll, but those claims have not been established through a publicly released original case file. That leaves the Sutcliffe theory exactly where it belongs, as a possibility that has been argued, not a proven solution. The most recent official public record located from West Yorkshire Police, published in February of 2025, still listed Carol Wilkinson's murder among unresolved cases. No one has been convicted since Anthony Steele's conviction was overturned. No alternative killer has been established in court. For Carol's family and those close to her, the consequences reached far beyond the original crime. A man was convicted, spent close to 2 decades in prison, and was later cleared of that conviction. By the time the justice system accepted that the confession could not safely support the verdict, more than 20 years had passed since Carol was killed. And that is what makes this case so unsettling. The central mystery is not just why Carol was attacked, it is how an investigation can appear to reach certainty, only for that certainty to unravel years later. One young woman lost her life. One young man lost much of his adulthood to a conviction later judged unsafe. And the person who actually killed Carol Wilkinson was never publicly identified. Nearly half a century later, the record still ends with the same unresolved fact. Carol left for work on a Monday morning in Bradford, was attacked near Woodhall Road, and died 2 days later from catastrophic injuries. The conviction that once seemed to close the case no longer stands. The theories that followed remain unproven. And somewhere inside the missing pieces of that investigation is the answer that Carol's case has never received. Who killed her?